John Kenneth Galbraith. In the spring of 1941, I was put in charge of organizing price control. There had been a huge increase in prices, a doubling, that left us with a fear of inflation. In retrospect, it was exaggerated. I was there until the middle of 1943. It was a watershed in my life. I went in as a young, unknown economist and came out of it with a nationwide reputation, for good or evil. Among us, there was a sense of collegial loyalty to Roosevelt that had existed before the war. We were for strong measures of conversion to war production. The foot-dragging was associated with those whose loyalty to FDR was not so great. Our proudest mark was that we were Roosevelt men. There is with World War II no memory of inflation, unlike World War I and Vietnam. It was partly due to our coming out of the Depression. There was an enormous opportunity for expanding output, as distinct from raising prices. In the war years, consumption of consumer goods doubled. Never in the history of human conflict has there been so much talk of sacrifice, and so little sacrifice. Another thing was the mood of the country. The war, unlike Vietnam, had almost unanimous support from the people. There was a strong objection to people who tried to circumvent controls. There was a black market, but it was small. There were troublesome moments in the case of meat, but there was a great deal of obloquy attached to illegal behavior. We greatly feared we'd hold the prices and see a decline in quality. It didn't materialize. Manufacturers, protecting their trademarks, were unwilling to risk reducing quality. There was a certain flow of shoddy goods, but it was unimportant. We had a problem with women's hosiery. We attempted to set standards on rayon hose, a substitute then for unavailable silk and nylon. That produced a storm. The Wholesale Dry Goods Institute had powerful spokesmen on the Hill. They were always looking for us. The canners set up a major row when we tried to couple price control with the grading of canned goods. That produced a political storm, too. We feared it would reduce the number of peas in the can. It didn't happen. What we discovered in 1942 was that we couldn't fix prices one at a time. I was given the job on the basis of a paper I had written. It was wrong in nearly all of its details. It concluded that consistency was the last resort of a small mind. It didn't take long for my attitude to change. We had started limiting controls to things in particularly short supply, which might be rationed. Things especially vulnerable to war demand. We found that was administratively impossible and inequitable. People who had their prices fixed looked at those who didn't and wondered why. In the spring of 1942, we put into effect the General Maximum Price Regulation, which fixed them all. Exceptions were some farm prices, protected by law. In special hardship cases, we eased back and adjusted as circumstances required. Chester Bowles, who had succeeded Prentice Brown as overall price administrator, Leon Henderson was the first, conducted some of the first polling ever done by the United States government. It always showed huge public support. Those who had their prices fixed, especially farmers, continued to complain. They were quite bitter, as well as politically powerful. It took very few cattlemen in Washington to keep you from feeling lonesome. The farmers had suffered 2 decades of very bad prices. With the war came a chance to retrieve. The barrier was price control. There was a great deal of opposition from them. We also had trouble with the smaller, more dispersed industries, where the market was competitive and the producers numerous. The larger companies were much easier to handle. They already had control of their prices, and there weren't very many of them to deal with. I once laid down a law. There is no great problem in fixing prices that are already fixed. Anyway, they were reaping gains in that their costs were controlled and in the enormous expansion of output. Price control was in effect until 1946. If it hadn't been for price control, we would have had doubling and tripling of prices, no question about it. There has been little appreciation of how great inflationary pressures would have been in the absence of controls, including restrictions on wages. The pressures were great on all of us in the matter of rationing as well. In 1942, we put into effect coffee rationing. It was extremely unpopular, especially in the Scandinavian and German communities. In retrospect, we perhaps shouldn't have done it. We should have left coffee to the market. There would have been less antagonism to shortages than to regulated supply. Leon Henderson was one of the unsung heroes of World War II. He had been the administrator of prices and civilian supply, as well as a powerful figure of the War Production Board. There has been an enormous literature on Albert Speer and the way he was presumed to have organized German production. Henderson, with a few younger colleagues, of which I was privileged to be one, organized the United States far more effectively than Germany had ever been. The man whose organization failed is celebrated, while the man who had in mind the successful national venture is lost to history. Day after day, he came back wearily from hearings, having fought the battle for some necessary action against recalcitrant trade associations, business executive types. The businessmen who came to Washington were generally industrial bureaucrats, public relation types, who could best be spared at home. There were many times when we nearly forgot there was a war going on. Our conflict with them was not ideological. It was over the fact that they never wanted to move. We have a public picture of the businessman as a dynamic figure, always ready for action. His wartime image was somebody who could never bring himself to action as the situation required. He would come to the conference and say, "Let us wait a while. I think this is something we'd accomplish on a voluntary basis. I'm sure business will see its responsibilities. This is not a time for radical action." We truly had to fight them all the way. The great principle of American war strategy is, we have airplanes, therefore they must be effective. Sometime in 1944, Roosevelt came to the conclusion that there was a large element of exaggeration and pure guesswork in what the Air Force was accomplishing. He responded to several suggestions that there should be an independent civilian commission established to go with the troops as they moved into France and Germany to find out what really happened. In the spring of 1945, I was brought into this by George Ball and Paul Nietzsche. The three of us formed the core of the operation under Henry Alexander, who came in from J.P. Morgan and Company. It had the advantage that you operated well out of the range of guns. Quite a few people find this advantageous in war, including some generals. The results were not in doubt. The bombing of Germany, both by the British and ourselves, had far less effect than was thought at the time. The German arms industry continued to expand its output until the autumn of 1944, in spite of the heaviest air attacks. Some of the best publicized attacks, including those on German ball bearing plants, practically grounded the 8th Air Force for months. Its losses were that heavy. At the end of the war, the Germans had ball bearings for export again. Our attacks on their airframe plants were a total failure. In the months after the Great Spring Raids of 1944, their production increased by big amounts. The reasons were threefold. First, the machine tools were relatively invulnerable. They'd be buried under rubble, but could be dug out in a day or two. Second, it was possible to decentralize production, to move the machinery into churches and schools. It was reorganized in much less time than was imagined. The Germans discovered that it wasn't necessary for production to be in a single factory. They also discovered a large range of substitutes. It was possible to redesign a lot of equipment to reduce the use of ball bearings. Third, it was possible to reorganize what had been sporadic and less than diligent management. The most disappointing of the attacks was on the airplane plants. Production was taken away from Hermann Göring, who was expansively incompetent, and put in the Speer Ministry, which was much better. This more than offset the damage done by the bombers. A similar case was in the bombing of Hamburg. It destroyed the center of the city and made available a large number of people: restaurant workers, bankers, teachers, cabaret performers, salesmen. they all became available as a working force in the war plants at the edge of the city. There had been two broad strategies. The British bombed at night and went for the central cities because that was all they could find. Naturally, working class areas were the most damaged. The middle classes lived on the outskirts and were hardly touched. This was true of most cities, ours and theirs. In general, poor people lived in the center, and the affluent lived on the edges. It was the East End of London that was hardest hit by the Luftwaffe, or a working-class city like Coventry. The same thing went for German cities. American strategy involved daylight raids. We aimed for the plants themselves. The problem was targeting. In a large number of cases, we couldn't hit them. There was a saying in 1945, "We made a major onslaught of German agriculture." I don't want to exaggerate. Some of the big plants were hit. One in central Germany, which produced synthetic fuels, was hit repeatedly. The attacks on the German oil supply had a considerable effect on the mobility of their ground forces. They were only successful because it was an enormous plant covering acres and acres, and we hit it repeatedly. The Germans had some hundreds of thousands of people at work repairing that plant all the time. The war for other people ended in the summer of 1945. For us, it continued on through that autumn in a major row with the Air Force. Naturally, they were far from enchanted with our figures as they became available. The instinct of the Air Force was first to deny the figures and then to suppress them. The overall conclusion was that wars were won by the slogging progress of the troops across France and into Germany, with a good deal of help from tactical air power, support for the actual movement of troops on the ground. It was an extended form of artillery. Strategic bombing was designed to destroy the industrial base of the enemy and the morale of its people. It did neither. Need I say that this conclusion was less than popular at the time? What about the firebombings of Tokyo? We concluded that, on the whole, the Japanese industry did not have the same recovery capacity as the German. When the Japanese war plants were hit, they were more likely to stay out of production. You have to remember that from 1941 to 45, Japan was a very small country with an equally small industrial base. It was stretched very tight and had little of the resilience of the German economy. Yet the firebombing of Japanese cities was not a decisive factor in the war. The war in Asia was won by the hard, slow progress up from the south and across the Pacific. All of war is cruel and unnecessary, but the bombings made this one especially so. The destruction of Dresden was unforgivable. It was done very late in the war, as part of a military dynamic which was out of control and had no relationship to any military needs. Didn't the dropping of the A-bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima shorten the Pacific War? The bomb did not end the Japanese War. This was something that was carefully studied by our bombing survey. Paul Nietzsche headed it in Japan, so there was hardly any bias in this matter. It's ironic that he has since become fascinated with the whole culture of destruction. The conclusion of the monograph called Japan's Struggle to End the War was that it was a difference at most of 2 or 3 weeks. The decision had already been taken to get out of the war, to seek a peace negotiation. The Japanese government at that time was heavily bureaucratic. The decision took some time to translate into action. There was also a fear that some of the army units might go in for a kind of kamikaze resistance. The decision was not known in Washington. While the bomb did not bring an end to the war, one cannot say Washington ordered the attacks in the knowledge that the war was coming to an end. Would not millions have been lost, American and Japanese, in the projected attack on the mainland, had it not been for the bomb? That is not true. There would have been negotiations for surrender within days or a few weeks under any circumstances. Before the A-bombs were dropped, Japan was a defeated nation. This was realized. This experience, as a member of the Commission, had an enormous effect on my attitudes. You had to see these German cities, city after city, in 1945, and then go on to the utter horror of Japanese cities to see how frightful modern air warfare is. There was nothing nice about ground warfare. 20,000 men were killed on the first day in the Battle of Somme in World War I, but this didn't have the high visibility of Berlin, Frankfurt, Mainz, Cologne. And to see Tokyo leveled to the ground, I was left with an image which has stayed with me all my life. Postscript. I was somewhat more vulnerable than others. I grew up in Canada. My father was a major influence in the community, where there were doubts about the justification of World War I. It was a feeling that this was something not the business of Scottish clans and Canadian farmers. The notion of resistance never crossed anybody's mind. On the other hand, my father had himself made a member of the draft board in order to exempt anybody who didn't want to go. My greatest memory is of a brilliant spring day in 1918. My father, a farmer, had a broken kneecap and was disabled. On this day, teams of horses with seeding and cultivating equipment appeared from all around. They were in the hands of people my father had exempted from service. All of our crops were planted in the space of 48 hours. It was all done as a surprise to us. Out of this background, I approached the whole subject of war with considerably less enthusiasm than some of my generation. I accepted the necessity of it in World War II. I was, on the whole, glad when we got in. I had been in Germany in 1937 and 1938, and there was no doubt as to the nature of the Hitler regime. Japan left no doubt after Pearl Harbor. But the visual impact of the air attacks and the horror of it is something I've lived with to this day.